They said he fell in love the moment she dropped her fan. Not because she was the most beautiful woman in the room, though she certainly tried to be, but because of how she dropped it. Too quickly. Too clumsily. Almost deliberately. And just like that, under the gold-drenched ceiling of a palace ballroom, a scandal began in silence. That was how love worked in the 18th century elite. It didn't arrive with fireworks or flowers. It crept in sideways, through glances held a little too long, a whisper disguised as etiquette, a perfume that lingered a second too much. Every ballroom was a battlefield. Every invitation, a test. And behind every powdered smile, 1,000 calculations. They called it courtship, but it looked more like espionage. The gentlemen wore velvet coats lined with silver buttons and lace at the wrists. Their hair was powdered, perfumed, and curled like a sculpted wig of smoke. The women, gowns so wide they needed help fitting through doors, cheeks flushed with vermilion, and beauty patches placed just so, near the mouth for flirtation, near the eye for passion, near the temple for mischief. But none of it was real. The elegance, the smiles, the coy laughter, all of it was a performance. A necessary one. In the upper circles of society, a poorly timed compliment could ruin your season. An impolite bow could cost you a marriage proposal. One wrong rumor, and you were no longer mysterious, just ruined. To survive this world, one had to wear desire like a mask. The elite didn't seduce each other in the shadows. They did it under chandeliers, surrounded by mothers, rivals, and chaperones. They danced minuets, carefully structured, pre-approved, while slipping folded notes into gloved hands when no one was looking. And yet, people still managed to fall in love. Or something like it. Behind the formalities were real feelings. They just weren't allowed to look like feelings. So, a woman might accidentally drop her fan in front of the wrong man. A gentleman might mistakenly take the wrong partner during a dance. Someone might leave their love letter unsealed, knowing very well it would be read by a third party. These were not accidents. These were moves in the game. And everyone was playing. Even the smallest gestures carried meaning. A woman could draw her fan across her cheek to say, "I love you." She could close it sharply to say, "Leave me alone." Every movement had a code, and every code had consequences. To the modern eye, it might have looked like restraint. But in truth, this world was electric. Passion simmered beneath the rules. Because when you're forbidden to touch, a shared look across a ballroom feels like fire. But make no mistake, elegance did not mean innocence. In fact, the more elegant someone appeared, the more dangerous they often were. Because in the end, the game wasn't about hearts. It was about reputations. One misstep could end a woman's marriage prospects. One whisper could strip a man of his inheritance. So, they moved carefully, danced gracefully, wrote cautiously, and longed desperately. This was the mask of elegance, where beauty was currency, charm was strategy, and real emotion had to be hidden beneath powdered skin and practiced smiles. And sooner or later, someone always forgot to play their part. Before there were texts, DMs, or even telephones, there were love letters. But in the 18th century elite world, they weren't just tokens of affection. They were weapons, sharp, strategic, and often deadly in the wrong hands. When a gentleman picked up his quill, dipped it in ink, and began his letter with "My dearest," it wasn't always out of passion. Sometimes, it was a calculated risk. Because in this society, a letter could start a romance, ignite a scandal, or destroy a reputation in 4 paragraphs or less. But the rules were unspoken and endless. You couldn't be too forward. That would be vulgar. Too reserved, and you'd seem disinterested. The trick was to say everything, without saying anything at all. A true master of the game might write something like, "Last evening, your absence at Lady Darlington's table left a curious silence at my end. The string quartet played tolerably, but not so well as your laughter would have accompanied it." To outsiders, it sounded polite. Boring, even. But to the recipient, it was a confession. "I watched for you. I missed you. And I was disappointed." Every word had weight. Every comma, a pause of the heart. And these letters weren't always private. Servants read them. Friends intercepted them. Mothers inspected them for signs of impropriety. A careless phrase could trigger gossip in drawing rooms across town before the wax even dried on the seal. So people wrote carefully, with layers of meaning. Women, especially, learned to read between the lines. A gentleman's letter might speak of flowers, but she'd know to look for what he wasn't saying. Was there hesitation in the ink? A smudge where a sentence had been scratched out? A phrase repeated from a letter he'd once written to someone else? There were books, manuals, even, that taught young women how to interpret these clues. Because falling in love was risky. But falling too soon, that was ruin. And when the correspondence did turn romantic, the stakes grew higher. A woman who returned a man's letter too quickly appeared eager, desperate, even. Wait too long, and he might move on. Many responded through trusted intermediaries, cousins, governesses, or friends, whose job was to deliver the letter without alerting the wrong eyes. A footman might tuck a folded page into a glove. A maid might hide one behind a mirror frame. And sometimes, those letters weren't innocent at all. Some were suggestive. Others, downright scandalous. But if discovered, a woman could be labeled a coquette or worse, and a man could face a duel for dishonouring another man's sister, even if he never touched her. Yet despite the risks, they kept writing. Because for many in the elite, it was the only way to say what they truly felt. The ballroom was a stage, the drawing room a trap, and every letter, a moment of stolen truth. Some fell in love through their words. Others only thought they did. Because in this game, seduction didn't always require bodies. Sometimes, just a beautifully folded piece of paper, tied with a silk ribbon and scented with a whisper of lavender, was enough to make someone lose sleep. And when the paper yellowed, and the ink faded, and the affair was long over, the letters still remained. Proof that, for a moment, beneath all the masks and manners, someone had dared to speak honestly. Nothing in elite society was ever truly private. Especially romance. Behind every soft glance and whispered word stood a wall of eyes, chaperones. Watchful, patient, and quietly ruthless, they were the silent enforcers of propriety. For a young woman of rank, going anywhere without one was a scandal in itself. And yet, evading them became an art form. A girl might have dreamed of moonlit walks or stolen kisses, but reality looked more like her aunt trailing 5 steps behind, carrying embroidery and suspicion. Chaperones weren't simply guardians, they were gatekeepers. Their role wasn't just to protect a lady's virtue, but to protect the family name. A single misstep, a laugh that lingered too long, a man standing too close, could be interpreted as intent. And in this world, intent could lead to ruin. But couples found ways. They learned the loopholes. A young man might offer to carry a lady's fan, a seemingly innocent gesture, which allowed them a moment of hand-to-hand contact. A brief touch, a brush of the fingers, charged with secret meaning. Or they might speak in riddles across the dinner table, using shared glances and metaphors to say what couldn't be spoken aloud. Sometimes, a borrowed book held a hidden note. Other times, a walk through the garden became a maze of maneuvering, with chaperones distracted by gossip or overly curious birds. In group settings, allies were essential. Sisters and cousins often became co-conspirators, helping to misdirect the adults just long enough for a flirtation to flourish. A friend might bump the chaperone's chair at just the right moment. A brother might fake a cough to buy a few seconds of privacy. Of course, this wasn't without risk. Chaperones were rarely fooled for long. Many had once played the game themselves, and lost. They knew the stakes. A daughter's future, a sister's marriage prospects, a family's entire social standing could hang on a single foolish moment. And if the gossip started, it spread fast, like candle wax on silk. So secrets became currency. Young lovers communicated in coded phrases and symbolic gestures. Dropping a glove meant "I want to see you." Wearing a certain brooch meant "meet me in the conservatory." Even the color of a ribbon could signal attraction, or withdrawal. In one famous case, a baron's daughter wore violet for weeks to secretly indicate she was no longer interested in her suitor. He, having no clue, continued writing sonnets until her mother finally intervened, with a polite but brutal invitation to a rival's engagement party. And so the game continued. Beneath the surface of formal teas, carriage rides, and piano recitals, entire empires of emotion rose and fell. Most affairs ended before they began. A chaperone intercepted a note. A father read a journal. A whisper reached the wrong ear. But for those who succeeded, who navigated the maze of supervision and suspicion, the reward was electric. Not just love, but victory. Because outwitting the system was part of the thrill. And yet, sometimes, even the cleverest players were caught. A late letter, a muddy shoe, a look held one beat too long. And in that moment, when the mask slipped and the scandal began to swell, it wasn't just reputations that were at stake. It was lives. Courtship in the 18th century elite wasn't merely a matter of affection, it was theater. A carefully staged performance of beauty, poise, and illusion. And no one was born ready for it. They were trained. From childhood, girls were taught that their face was not a face, it was a canvas. And men, their posture, their scent, their voice, all tools in a silent war of seduction. Powder came first. White as porcelain, dusted over the skin to erase any trace of nature. Pale skin meant leisure. Pale skin meant power. But the powder was often laced with lead, softening wrinkles while slowly poisoning the wearer. Still, a noble woman would not be seen without it. Rouge was next, a small crimson dot on each cheek, meant to mimic the natural flush of desire. A lie, painted with squirrel hair brushes. Too much, and one looked vulgar. Too little, and one seemed indifferent. The balance was delicate and deliberate. Perfume wasn't just fragrance, it was weaponry. With bathing rare and streets reeking of filth, a good scent could turn heads and hold them. Musk, rose, civet, exotic oils whispered stories of faraway lands and untamed longing. A man's cologne might linger in a lady's glove for weeks, stirring quiet rebellion in her pulse each time she caught the trace. But this theater extended beyond the mirror. Speech, too, had to be rehearsed. A stammer could be fatal. A careless phrase, social suicide. One must appear clever but not threatening, witty but not coarse, flirtatious but never forward. It was a constant high-wire act, especially for women, who were expected to suggest interest without ever saying so. Men rehearsed lines like actors. Not just compliments, but phrases of power. To call a lady resplendent instead of pretty could earn a blush. To quote poetry, especially in French, often made hearts flutter. Even the way a man bowed, the angle of his leg, the duration of eye contact, all calibrated to invite without insisting. Clothing was its own language. Corsets cinched waists until breathing became optional. Bustles lifted hips into impossible geometry. Wigs towered like chandeliers, powdered, perfumed, and pinned with tiny birds or ships. A lady's dress could weigh 20 pounds, yet she was expected to glide like mist. Men, too, had their costumes. Silk stockings, velvet waistcoats, powdered wigs, not a hair out of place. A gentleman might spend more on buttons than on books. But it wasn't vanity. It was armor. The right look could secure a glance. The wrong one could sink an entire proposal. The ballroom became their stage. Eyes flickered. Fans opened and closed in coded language. A dropped handkerchief might start a courtship. A shared minuet could seal a future. But every step, every gesture, had to be rehearsed, because one slip meant more than embarrassment. It meant exile. Behind the sparkle of candlelight and the scent of jasmine, every member of society knew the truth. This was a world of masks, of illusion, of power played in satin and lace. And if you couldn't perform, you couldn't belong. Before texting, before phone calls, before even the idea of speaking freely in public, there were letters. And in the 18th century, letters weren't just messages. They were weapons of seduction. A single sentence could tilt a heart. A comma in the wrong place could kill a proposal. Love was fought on paper, and the best players wielded ink like a dagger. Every elite young man was taught to write with style. His script had to be legible, yes, but it also had to sing. Sentences flowed like poetry, often in French or Latin, sprinkled with subtle allusions to classical mythology. To write "I long for you" was crude. But to write "You are my Persephone, and I wither in your absence," now that could melt resistance. Women, too, became masters of nuance. A lady might write a letter thick with praise for a gentleman's wit, but never mention his face. She could sign off with a phrase like "I remain, your humble servant." But the curl of the Y might suggest far more. And the delivery of the letter? A ritual in itself. Rarely handed directly. No, that would be far too bold. Letters traveled through maids, footmen, hat boxes, and sometimes even the folds of a fan. A gentleman might tuck his note inside a volume of Shakespeare, left accidentally on a garden bench. But a reply wasn't guaranteed. In fact, silence could speak volumes. A delayed response meant caution. A too quick reply? Desperation. And heaven forbid you received a letter returned unopened. That was a wound worse than any public rejection. Yet some letters never reached their destination at all. Parents intercepted them. Butlers burned them. Jealous rivals forged them. And in one especially scandalous case recorded in 1778, a nobleman sent 4 to 7 pages of heartfelt prose to a woman who was, it turned out, illiterate. Of course, for the letters that did survive, a secret world bloomed. They included shared poems, invented languages, elaborate metaphors, and sometimes tiny pressed flowers, or locks of hair tied with blue silk ribbon. One popular courtship tactic was to spritz the letter with one's own perfume, allowing the scent to haunt the recipient's pillow. But beware, every letter was a risk. Because in high society, nothing stayed secret for long. Gossip was currency. Servants read what they carried. And a poorly phrased confession could travel faster than a fire in dry hay. Some men lost their careers to a single misjudged line. Some women lost their reputation and their marriage prospects from a misplaced flourish of affection. But even so, they kept writing. Because when the world was watching every glance, every step, and every smile, letters were the only place left to be honest. Or, at least, to pretend you were. In elite 18th century society, desire was not denied, it was danced around, hidden behind layers of etiquette and silk. And at the center of this careful choreography stood an ever-watchful figure, the chaperone. No respectable young woman of status went anywhere alone. Not to the park, not to the opera, not even to the next room, unless her mother, her aunt, or a particularly hawk-eyed governess trailed behind like a moral shadow. It wasn't just about protection. It was performance. The presence of a chaperone signaled that the girl was pure, well-trained, untouched, valuable. But if a man could get past that guardian wall, or even around it, that's when the game truly began. You see, touch was the most dangerous act of all. A glance could be explained away. A letter could be denied. But a touch, even accidental, could set tongues wagging. A gentleman brushing a lady's glove during a waltz could spark a week's worth of speculation. And if his hand lingered for just a moment too long, scandal. Which is precisely why couples developed entire systems of coded communication. Fans were not just for cooling oneself. They were full-on romantic semaphores. A closed fan meant I'm indifferent. Tapping it slowly against your lips meant kiss me. Dropping it, very gently, meant follow me. Handkerchiefs were deployed like chess pieces. A folded one clutched in the right hand could signal openness. A dropped one might be bait. A borrowed one, practically a contract. Even parasols had their own language. The angle of the handle, the rhythm of a tilt. To the untrained eye, it looked like fidgeting. To lovers in waiting, it was a conversation. Still, real intimacy was rare. Because with every step, someone was watching. A lady's maid might report to her mistress. A stable boy might whisper to the cook. And then there was the sheer terror of being seen in the wrong place at the wrong time. One nobleman in 1783 was caught hiding under a piano in the drawing room, claiming, bizarrely, that he'd dropped a coin. A young woman was found accidentally walking the same garden path as her suitor, at night, without her bonnet. She was married off to a cousin by the end of the week. Because the stakes were never small. For a man, a minor scandal could bruise his reputation. But for a woman, it could mean ruin. No marriage, no dowry, no place in society, which is why many played it safe, while others risked everything. And still, they kept dancing, kept passing fans, kept brushing fingertips behind velvet curtains. Because in a world obsessed with appearances, even the smallest touch felt like rebellion. And rebellion, whispered through silk and lace, was often the most thrilling seduction of all. By the late 1700s, everyone at court wore a mask, not of silk or velvet, but of artifice. A man's virtue lay in his waistcoat, a woman's value, in her lineage and dowry. But underneath the powdered wigs, the polished manners, and the stiff social rituals, lay a battlefield of hidden agendas. Marriage wasn't about love. It was about alliances, about land, about bloodlines, about family names that echoed through parlors and parliament alike. And so proposals, the moment of supposed romance, were often less about hearts and more about strategy. A duke might propose to the daughter of a viscount not because he adored her smile, but because her father had influence in parliament. A baron's son might woo a merchant's daughter simply to revive his family's dwindling finances. And if the girl refused, her father might refuse her, cutting her off or shipping her to a country estate until she changed her mind. And yet, publicly, everything had to look like a fairy tale. Proposals were staged like miniature theatre performances. Some took place at grand balls, during the final waltz of the evening, the music swelling, the candles flickering, a knee lowering onto polished marble. Others were declared in gardens, surrounded by rose bushes and statuary, just in time for a hovering aunt to accidentally witness it all. It was a show for society, one that often masked desperation. A woman past the age of 25 might smile through gritted teeth at a proposal she detested, simply because it was her last good offer. A man drowning in debt might rehearse his speech a dozen times before offering his hand to the wealthiest plain girl in town. Of course, not everyone was so calculating. There were real romances, whispered behind fans and sealed with trembling hands. But even those, especially those, had to be cloaked in strategy. One wrong move, one premature declaration of affection, could ruin both parties. A man too eager might be seen as vulgar. A woman too willing might be labeled easy. So they lied. About their feelings. About their pasts. About their intentions. A letter might be rewritten 3 times before being sent. A conversation might be rehearsed in a mirror before a garden stroll. Even a compliment could be laced with hidden meaning, its timing calculated down to the second. And when the proposal finally came, whether beneath a chandelier or among manicured hedges, it was rarely a surprise. The woman had known. Her mother had known. Her friends had known for weeks. The only surprise was how well she would pretend not to have expected it. That was the game. Because in 18th century society, to win a heart, or a fortune, you first had to master the art of pretending you didn't want it at all. A kiss could ruin you. Not because it was sinful, though it certainly was, in the eyes of the church, but because the neighbors might find out. In 18th century elite society, what mattered most wasn't what you did in private. It was what couldn't be denied in public. A gentleman might bet a maid and be met with a shrug. But if he was caught kissing a marquis's daughter behind the rose arbor, he might find himself in a duel by dawn, or worse, on the losing end of a scandal sheet. You see, mornings after weren't just about headaches and rumpled sheets. They were about reputation maintenance. For women, this meant corsets laced tighter, eyes a little wider, and voices trained to tremble just enough when saying, "I simply don't know what he was thinking," even if she'd kissed him first. For men, it meant visiting tailors to remove perfume traces from lapels. It meant vague stories told at the club, with just enough detail to imply conquest, and just enough discretion to avoid naming names. Because the moment a name was spoken, everything changed. Gossip moved faster than carriages. By the time tea was poured, a duchess's affair might be common knowledge among the footmen. By supper, it might be on the lips of every dowager in London. And by morning, she might find her dance card empty, her letters unanswered, and her portrait quietly removed from her cousin's drawing room. This was the price of passion. Not guilt, but exposure. There were tactics, of course. Lovers used servants as alibis, bribed coachmen, and burned letters as a matter of routine. Some even kept false lovers, decoys, to mislead suspicion. Others, more daring, leaned into their scandal. A notorious widow might flaunt her affairs with a wicked grin and a feathered fan, daring society to snub her. And they often didn't, because everyone loved a well-dressed disaster. But for the vast majority, the morning after was a balancing act between denial and damage control. Reputation wasn't a thing you owned. It was a fragile illusion, rented from the crowd. And one misstep, one lover who talked, one servant who whispered, one letter that wasn't burned, could tear it down in a single afternoon. So when lovers parted at sunrise, they didn't say, "I'll miss you." They said, "Say nothing." Because in the gentleman's game, love might be reckless. But reputation was everything. She never said it out loud. But her fans said everything. In elite 18th century society, seduction was rarely spoken. It was signaled, whispered through gestures, gazes, and the subtle flutter of lace-gloved fingers. You see, a woman couldn't approach a man directly. Not in public. Not without risking everything. But she could drop her handkerchief. She could glance once, twice, hold the third a second too long. And if he understood the rules, he'd know exactly what she meant. These weren't just flirtations. They were codes, practiced, perfected, passed down like family heirlooms. A closed fan meant I'm not interested. A half-open fan in the right hand. Meet me later. A slow draw of the glove could be an invitation. A misstep on the dance floor. Sometimes, not a misstep at all. Everything about courtship in high society was cloaked in layers. Layers of silk. Layers of protocol. Layers of carefully constructed games. And beneath it all, desire simmered, just barely contained. Letters were written in invisible ink. Phrases like the weather has turned warm might mean far more than the temperature. A brooch moved from one shoulder to the other could signal a change of heart, or a changed allegiance. Even fashion became a secret language. A man's waistcoat might feature embroidered roses if he sought a tryst. A woman might pin a small silver key to her corset ribbons, a sign she was no longer under her father's watchful thumb. It was flirtation at the level of espionage. And like spies, lovers had their ciphers and their codes of silence. No one admitted anything, but everyone knew. The genius of it all was that nothing was ever provable. No word too explicit. No touch too long. No glance without a secondary meaning that could be plausibly denied. And so, affairs bloomed not in bedrooms, but in ballrooms, drawing rooms, garden paths at twilight. All built on implication, on practiced restraint. Because in the gentleman's game, boldness wasn't power. Subtlety was. And the most skilled players? They could ruin reputations. With a smile. Before she ever spoke a word, she had already said everything. With her ruse. In elite 18th century society, appearance wasn't vanity. It was strategy. A woman's toilette, the ritual of dressing and beautifying, was an act of warfare as much as romance. Her face was a canvas. Her hair, a monument. Her scent, a calling card. It took hours. The powdering of the wig, the rouge to the cheeks, the white lead to the face to erase all signs of sun and labor. Because only the lower classes were ever tanned. High society prized the pale skin, pale lashes, powdered hair. It was a kind of blank slate onto which wealth and purity could be painted. But beneath that polished surface, the art of seduction bloomed. Lip stain drawn just slightly outside the natural shape of the mouth. Beauty patches, or mouches, placed with deliberate symbolism. One near the lips signaled flirtation. One near the eye hinted at passion. A patch on the cheekbone. Dangerous. That was the mark of a coquette. Men played the game too, of course. They powdered their faces, ruined their cheeks, spritzed their lace cuffs with perfume so their scent lingered on a lady's glove long after a dance had ended. Perfume, in fact, did more than cover scent. It signaled intent. A hint of rosewater whispered softness. A sharper musk promised confidence. Some scents were rumored to heighten desire. Others, to mask it. And let's not forget the wigs. Towering constructions of powdered hair and ribbons, rising like monuments above the head. They weren't just stylish. They were symbolic. The higher the hair, the higher one's status, and sometimes, the higher the stakes. One duchess famously hid love notes in hers. Another tucked in a miniature portrait of her lover, visible only when she turned just so. In a world where women were told to be silent, their powder spoke volumes. Their ruse flirted. Their perfumes promised. And as they descended the staircase, gown rustling, fan poised, they became living, breathing invitations. Or warnings. It all depended on how well you read the signs. Because in the gentleman's game, to misinterpret a beauty patch was to risk scandal. But to understand it, that was foreplay. She was not a lady in the eyes of society. But she could unmake one. The courtesan stood on the fringes of respectability, but at the very center of power. She did not inherit wealth, she accumulated it. She had no husband, but often more influence than a wife. She was not invited to the grandest balls. And yet, nobles wrote her letters sealed in desperation. Princes sent her silk gloves still warm from their hands. And dukes bent at her doorstep, hoping for a glance. While noble women were bound by rules, the courtesan lived by calculation. She understood that in this game, men prized novelty, intelligence, performance. and the illusion of choice. Many began with nothing. A sempstress, a singer, a lady's maid. Then, one night, a baron's eyes lingered too long. A witty reply. A laugh at just the right pitch. A perfectly chosen shade of blue to make her eyes unforgettable. From there, an invitation. A keepsake. A patron. And then the climb began. She learned how to wield conversation like a blade. How to turn the faintest sigh into a promise. How to make a man feel as though she was his secret. His prize. His ruin. She studied the art of the handwritten note, where the placement of a comma, the softness of the ink, or the hurried slant of a line could suggest longing or disdain. She knew which perfumes lingered longest on linen. She knew when silence was more arousing than speech. And unlike the highborn wives, whose marriages were contracts, whose nights were duty, the courtesan chose. That was her real power. Not that men desired her, but that she could say no. And they knew it. Some were scorned, yes, shunned in salons, mocked in plays. But others, they built estates. They became legends whispered about behind fans at garden parties. And more than once, they taught queens how to win back kings. The courtesan had no crown. But in the gentleman's game, she could take one if she wished. Because while other women played by the rules, she rewrote them. Every game has rules. But in 18th century courtship, the most powerful rules were the ones never written down. A gentleman might learn fencing or Latin, but no tutor could teach him how to survive a scandal. A lady might be trained in embroidery or music, but she was also expected to master the art of avoiding disgrace. And yet, some of the most influential figures in elite society were the very ones who broke those invisible codes and lived to whisper about it. You see, ruin came swiftly, especially for women. A single night unchaperoned, a love letter discovered, a glance held too long in public, and a reputation could collapse like wet lace. The term fallen woman wasn't just poetic. It was social exile in a corset. And once fallen, there was rarely a way back. Unless, of course, you understood the rules. Rule 1, don't get caught. It wasn't the affair that destroyed a lady, it was the evidence. So secrets became currency. Friends were chosen carefully, and servants were paid well to forget what they heard behind closed doors. Rule 2, blame the man. A clever woman could play the role of innocent. Shocked, heartbroken, led astray. If her tears landed just right and her voice trembled at the right word, society might forgive her. After all, men were expected to sin. Women were expected to survive it. Rule 3, marry quickly. Scandal could be neutralized by a sudden engagement, especially if the suitor was wealthy enough to make everyone forget what they'd whispered the week before. In some cases, families even arranged hasty weddings before the ink dried on the gossip pamphlets. Rule 4, control the narrative. If ruin was inevitable, some turned it into legend. They leaned into the drama. They dressed boldly, laughed louder, and became stories in their own right. A ruined duchess might host the most exclusive salon in Paris. A disgraced lord might become the darling of a new literary circle, known for his scandalous memoirs. In the gentleman's game, ruin wasn't always the end. Sometimes, it was a rebranding. And while some players were cast out, others learned how to weaponize shame, how to turn public curiosity into power. Because once a person was already ruined, there were no rules left to follow, only those they made for themselves. By the 1780s, getting dressed was no longer just a matter of vanity. It was strategy, a form of silent theater performed each morning, not for comfort, but for control. Elite society understood something modern minds often forget. What you wore told the world exactly who you were, and who you intended to conquer. Men powdered their wigs not just for fashion, but to display wealth. The whiter the powder, the purer the prestige, a sign that you didn't labor under the sun, or break a sweat for your coin. Their coats were stitched with gold thread, their stockings pulled high over calves that were sometimes stuffed for effect. After all, a man's leg, yes, his leg, was once considered the most seductive part of his body. Women, meanwhile, approached their toilette like preparing for battle. The paints, the pastes, the rouges, they weren't just cosmetics. They were weapons in a war of appearances. The face was smoothed with ceruse, a deadly lead-based foundation that created a ghost-like pallor. It gave the illusion of nobility, and slowly poisoned its wearer. Rouge was dabbed high on the cheeks, the redder, the better. Not to mimic innocence, but to suggest delicious indiscretion. A woman who wore rouge wasn't pretending to be modest. She was daring the room to wonder what she'd done the night before. Fake beauty spots, known as mouches, were pasted onto the skin. Not randomly, but according to an unspoken code. One near the mouth whispered flirtation. One near the eye suggested passion. One on the décolletage. Scandal. Even posture was a performance. Corsets cinched the waist into shapes no human body could naturally hold. Waistlines shrank, ribs bruised, and breathing became a chore. But the silhouette? Divine. Every curtsy, every turn of the head, every glance across a fan, was choreographed. The goal wasn't comfort. It was to unsettle, to captivate, to control the gaze of the room without ever seeming to try. And in that way, the dressing room became the rehearsal stage for a daily opera of seduction. Because in the gentleman's game, the first move was often made without a word. Just powder, paint, and perfectly practiced poise. If spoken words were dangerous, written ones were lethal. In 18th century elite society, courtship often bloomed not in parlors, but on parchment. Love letters were the currency of seduction, and each line was a gamble. A gentleman didn't simply confess desire, he crafted it, with metaphors drawn from Roman poetry, and innuendos laced in elegant French. Your absence is a wound, one might write, but your last glance still burns in my blood. And with those few lines, a new affair began, or a reputation ended. Letters were passed like contraband, slipped into fans, dropped into glove compartments, folded into prayer books. And they were never meant to remain private. Oh no, they were trophies. A woman might show her friend a man's letter to prove her desirability. Or worse, she might show his rival. That's how duels started. For men, letters were a form of tactical flattery. For women, they were proof, leverage, a way to hold power over their suitor's next move. Some letters weren't even real. A clever lady's maid, for example, might forge a note to make her mistress seem pursued by more men than she truly was. Others were dictated by professional scribes, ghostwriters of the heart, who made a living penning believable longing on behalf of clueless nobles. But not all letters were filled with charm. Some were riddled with venom. An affair turned sour, a suitor rejected. Expect a letter dripping with Latin insults, moral condemnation, and very polite threats. And yet, these exchanges were rarely destroyed. In fact, many women kept them bundled with ribbon in scented boxes, tucked away like sacred relics of a battlefield long abandoned. Because in the gentleman's game, your words were your weapons, but your silence was your shield, and one misplaced syllable could be your undoing. In the highest rooms of the 18th century elite, scandal wasn't feared. It was finessed. It began as whispers. Behind fans, behind curtains, behind the backs of husbands too polite to suspect a thing. But those whispers were deliberate, calculated, planted like seeds. You see, scandal was not always an accident. Sometimes, it was the plan. If a woman wished to elevate her desirability, all she needed was a rumor. A glance held too long with a foreign prince. A carriage ride taken without a chaperone. A silk ribbon found in a man's waistcoat pocket. The truth didn't matter. The possibility did. In fact, nothing accelerated a courtship quite like a well-timed scandal. For the suitor, it raised the stakes. She was wanted, admired, risky. And for the lady, it brought her suitors to heel, reminded them she was no one's possession, yet. Some orchestrated their own downfall just to be noticed. A broken engagement, a fainting spell at the opera, an overheard argument with a baron. These could all be turned into chess moves. Because in this society, reputation wasn't just a social standing. It was a narrative. And if you knew how to control that story, you controlled everyone else's behavior. But scandal was a double-edged sword. Pushed too far, and you were not alluring, you were ruined. Especially for women. One misstep and a duchess could find herself whispered out of every ballroom and into exile at her aunt's country estate. Men had more rope to swing with. A well-handled scandal could even make a man more desirable. Roguish, daring, dangerous in the right way. Some used it to pivot social alliances. A minor nobleman might seduce the wife of a political rival, not out of lust, but to gain influence, or blackmail her into convincing her husband to support his ambitions. It was all a performance, a dangerous game of emotional fencing. And the best players never raised their voices, never broke a sweat. They just smiled, and let others draw the wrong conclusions. Because the gentleman's game wasn't played with hearts. It was played with reputations. There always came a moment. After the dances, the duels, the letters, the laced insinuations, when the game reached its final move. Not always a proposal. Not always a kiss. Sometimes, it was a quiet retreat. Other times, a scandalous union that sent tremors through the drawing rooms of London or Paris. But it was never left to chance. By the time a gentleman dropped to one knee or a lady allowed herself to be caught alone in a moonlit garden, the outcome had long been decided. Every smile, every silence, every well-staged misunderstanding had built toward this moment. In elite society, courtship was never truly about love. It was about advantage. And if love did appear, it was a luxury or a liability. For some, the game ended in triumph. A match made not just of hearts, but of titles, estates, and mutual respect. Their names were announced in newspapers, their portraits painted together. But for others, the final move was defeat. The woman who waited too long, the man who miscalculated her virtue, the pair who fell too deeply, too publicly, and shattered the fragile rules of discretion. They were exiled, married off hastily, or quietly separated by their families. Their names no longer floated in candlelit conversations, but sank, heavy and unspoken, to the bottom of society's memory. Yet even those endings had their audience, because failure in the gentleman's game could be just as delicious to watch as victory. And so, new players stepped forward. New dances began. New glances were exchanged beneath chandeliers that had seen it all before. The powdered wigs would go out of fashion. The etiquette books would gather dust. But the game, the elegant, maddening, irresistible game of pursuit, that would never vanish. Because as long as there were rules, someone would always be clever enough to break them with style.